Hey guys, welcome back to Chat with the Mindful Beekeepers. I'm your host, Nathalie B, and I am a Texas master beekeeper. And I work with a gentleman named Les Crowder who has a lot of experience on beekeeping, natural beekeeping. And we are trying to answer everybody's questions every Monday night at 7:30. So I'm going to let people into the room. And if you have any questions, just let us know. I'm going to welcome everybody in and we'll get started. Les, how are you doing? Thank you for joining us. We're live on YouTube as well, and we're letting everybody kicking in. Welcome back, and thank you for your time tonight again, Les. Appreciate it.
I'm doing well. How about you, Natalie?
I'm doing good. I did some bee work today. How about yourself?
I didn't do much bee work. I was trying to write. I had some I felt inspired to write down, and I spent a fair amount of time writing it.
Very good. So I want to welcome everybody that just joined us on Zoom. And if you have questions, we'd love to get started with a couple questions if you have some in the pipeline. We realize that sometimes we'll run out of time when we're talking about our theme. So we wanted to give you the opportunity to kind of first get jumping on some of those questions. And if you don't have any for us right away, hi, Richard. It's good to see you. Sarita and Larry, Brad is on, Sherry's on, and then we've got some new people as well. So welcome to everybody. Ray's here as well. If you have questions, remember you can use your chat button at the bottom. And then if not, we'll get talking about some stuff like some of the things we've seen this weekend during the apprenticeship and the theme for tonight. So Les, do you have any preliminary thoughts before we jump into questions, or do you want to start with the theme?
Well, you reminded me about the class that we taught Saturday.
Mm-hmm.
Brad was there. Hey, Brad.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminded me that we had somebody there who didn't come very prepared, and we as beekeepers just need to remember that when we show people our bees, we should really emphasize to them that they need to dress appropriately and wear a veil. I think we pretty much have a rule that they have to wear a veil.
Mm-hmm.
And then I recognize that we work outside in the sun a lot, and we're kind of used to it. And that some people who don't work in the sun need to really be careful because they were getting overheated, and it affected their judgment a little bit. So that's interesting. And nobody got hurt or anything. Everybody was fine, but it just reminded me, why would you show up to a bee class in flip-flops and shorts and a sleeveless shirt and no veil? But we just have to remind people, bees are serious. They can hurt you if they choose to.
So we do have a liability waiver that we make sure, especially if somebody's showing up with very little protective clothing, that they sign that liability waiver as a first step. We also make sure that they at the very least have a veil on their face. But you're right. I mean, we at some point we have to remind people, are you sure you're comfortable being around the hives? Because if if one gets you stung, then the frenzy starts usually. You're marked and there's alarm pheromones that kick in. And so it can end up increasing the defensiveness of the hive. So we really think it's better to be more protected than underprotected. Because what happens also is that when we have people like that, if anybody gets stung during the class, then all of a sudden we have to kind of address this. And we have 20 people and 2 teachers. So that's always something to be mindful of. Are you able, when you're teaching classes yourselves or when you're in a group, are you able to get the attention that you need? And so that's why it's very important. That also brings up the point of when you're going to do bees, unless you know what you're doing and you have a full protective bee suit and you're protected entirely, things happen. And if you're by yourself, if you have an adverse reaction to the sun and you feel dizzy and you get heat stroke, or you get stung and you get scared and something happens, you forget to zip up your veil, you get stung up, and that can become very dangerous, right, Les?
Yeah, even when I was a young man, I remember working through some bees and it was a very hot day, over 100 degrees. And at some point I got dizzy and I thought, I need to stop and go get a drink. And I got in the back of my truck and started cleaning my smoker. I suddenly realized my mind I'm not thinking straight here. I need a drink. I don't need to clean my smoker. Well, and I realized this is dangerous. That I could, because I was about a mile from a house. I was 10 miles from a gas station to get it, so I was in, and I went to the house. I drove to the house, knocked on the door. He looked at me and he gave me a drink of water. I could feel it hit my belly. I could feel it come up my body and flush in my head. Like, oh, phew. And he said, well, you just got your color back. I said, okay, that was dangerous. So, we need to respect the heat too. And we need to respect the bees. And dressing up is just showing them basic respect. And then, because once you start getting stung, you might get other people stung. You put everybody at risk, as I saw Bradley had mentioned that. We all wind up paying the price for it. So just respect your bees. Don't fear them, but respect them. They're very worthy of respect. They can really hurt you. They don't want to hurt you. They just want to be left alone. But give them good respect. They deserve it.
Yes. So thank you for that very important reminder. And I must admit, I'm used to doing bees outside in Texas in the heat. And for some reason, the level of humidity was pretty high. And I felt after, a couple, 3 hours of talking and working bees and just teaching, without drinking water, obviously, because I didn't have time, then I felt dizzy a little bit and I felt out of breath. So I had to take a break and I had to sit in my car in the air conditioning for 5 minutes. And just kind of really be mindful of that. We really need to be careful. A lot of people end up with heat stroke, beekeepers, especially in Texas. So just be mindful of that. I wanted to say good morning to Grant Jackson and to Jay Arnold on YouTube. Thank you guys for joining us again tonight. We really appreciate you. If you guys have any questions, go ahead, ask them away, and we'll address them as we go. In the meantime, do you have something else to discuss before we get on in our theme, Les, about this weekend, the apprenticeship, or anything else?
No, not really. I'm ready to tell a story or two about the theme.
Okay, so tonight our main theme for the discussion, and again, we can just jump in with questions and change complete direction as you think of things and that you want answers to specific topics and things that you see in your bee yards. But Les wanted to bring up a few things about pesticides and plastics, both in our hives and out in our world. So it's kind of opening it up a little bit more to responsibility, mindfulness of what we do, not just with our bees, but what we do around ourselves and how it impacts others potentially. Right, Les?
Right, exactly. What brought this up was I just saw somebody posted to me. They had 2 fairly strong hives. They had gotten up to 7 or 8 combs. And then they went and found all the bees completely dead. Little pile in front of the hive, bunch of dead bees inside the beehive. Both hives died at the same time. Well, that sounds very much like experiences I have had with a major pesticide use in the neighborhood. And so I don't know much about that neighborhood. And it can be very hard to track it down because, it may take a test. You may have to package up some bees and send them off and get them tested and then try to figure out who is using that type of pesticide within several miles of your bees to figure out who did it and if they did it according to label. It gets into a real sticky wicket. I had that experience as a young man, as a kid really, with 20 hives. that I came across, and I may have mentioned this before, but I was going to take a whole bunch of honey off 20 beehives and get ready for a flavor change. The alfalfa was finishing, the purple sage was going to bloom. I wanted to get the supers emptied. This was back in my Langstroth days, so that I could let them refill them with purple sage honey.
I was
And
going to ask you if you can explain, you're doing basically monofloral variety of honey when you do that. Can you kind of expand a little bit? I know we're kind of diverting a little bit from the topic, but I think that a lot of people would be interested on how to achieve those results and get some of that monofloral taste and just kind of really isolating main flavors.
yeah, that's a good point. What it takes is learning your flowers. And by that time, I had learned what flowers are significant to honeybees in New Mexico at that time. Now it's changed considerably. New Mexico has dried up and it's gotten harder to make the honey. But often in June, we made alfalfa honey this was on a native tribe reservation. And they had a lot of farm fields and they were fairly organic oriented.
Isn't the alfalfa the one that crystallizes really fast?
Yeah, it crystallizes fairly fast, not as fast as mesquite.
Okay.
But it's a darker, stronger honey. But it's a real good honey. And on a good year, you could make, I could make 100 pounds of just alfalfa honey per hive back in those days. So it was significant. And I had a lot of it on all the hives. Now, by the end of July, it pretty well, even though it has some bloom, and they cut it to make hay, and when it comes back and blooms again, it doesn't make honey in August for whatever reason. So I knew that I needed to get it off, and there was a bush in the deserts up out of the Rio Grande River Valley that would bloom in August, and it would make a really delicious reddish honey that we called purple sage. The bush has bluish leaves, hardly has any leaves. It has photosynthetic stems, but it would get these bright purple flowers and just smell so good. And the whole desert would turn purple in certain places with this particular bush. And they would make a tremendous, delicious honey with a reddish tint to it from that plant. So I wanted to get the alfalfa out before the purple sage bloomed so that they wouldn't mix them, because if they mixed them, the alfalfa would overpower the purple sage and it would all taste like alfalfa. And I knew that was end of July, 1st of August was my time when that one door closed and the other was going to open, where I needed to do that harvest. Mm-hmm. So I went and checked the bees. They were roaring and just thousands of bees coming and going from each hive and stacked up real high and heavy. It was like, oh, this is going to be great. I'm going to do well. I'm going to make some money. Next day, I come back with my pickup full of empty supers so that I can take the full ones off and give them at least 1 or 2 empties. And when I pull into the bee yard, it's silent.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
And I thought, what the heck? And I looked, and there was a pile about 2 feet deep in front of every hive, all 20 of them, of dead bees, just piled up on top of each other. Then I just popped a lid without even lighting my smoker. And there were a few dead bees up in the supers and smears of bee throw up or feces, whatever, all inside on the cappings, all over the combs. The hives were completely dead.
That's crazy. All
of them completely dead, and had died that afternoon after I checked them. So I was sort of heartbroken. I was an 18-year-old or 19, something like that. I drove to the tribal office where I knew the governor, and I said, Andy, my bees are all dead. And he said, oh, shoot, that's terrible. You know that guy that raises corn over there? And I knew who he was. He wasn't a tribal member, but he had gotten a lease and he was farming corn on the native property using their water, and he was paying the tribe a lease. Well, he was a Vietnam vet. He was crazy. Let's just put it that way. He was a crazy guy.
Oh, that's the guy that has the guns that you were telling
Yeah.
me, right? Mhm.
So he was, I think he was spraying his corn. So I decided, okay, I'm going to go talk to him at least. Try to talk to him. So I got my pickup, drove back out, found Harlan's house, mobile home that he'd put on the reservation. And as soon as I drove up, he came out with a pistol in his hand and started cussing at me. You blankety blank beekeepers, get the hell out of here, blankety blank blank. And I decided, okay, I just got back in my pickup and drove away because I figured he might actually shoot me. And I didn't know what to do about it. I wound up setting a fire to all 20 hives and kind of piling them up. I didn't know what to do because I couldn't use the supers. I was leery of the boxes. What he had used was called PenCap M. It was a micro-encapsulated pesticide that the bees gathered as if it were pollen, because it was in little plastic beads, little tiny microscopic plastic beads. And they took it into the hive, and then it burst loose and killed all the bees. And it was a terrible formulation of a pesticide that killed, well, probably hundreds of thousands of beehives all over the United States. And it took forever for the various beekeeping organizations to get it banned, but we finally did get it banned. We still have things we need to ban. Like in Albuquerque, there was a neighborhood where a guy called me and he said, all my bees are crawling on the ground. Most of them are dead. And they can't fold their wings. Their wings are stuck out funny. And they're walking around kind of like shaking and jittery. And they can't seem to fold their wings, the few bees that are left alive. And I said, oh, and that sounds like somebody sprayed a pesticide. Sure enough, I called somebody else in that same neighborhood. He went out and looked and he said, my bees are doing the same thing. So we called the city, and the city tried to help us pinpoint it. We got a journalist who's a beekeeper for the local newspaper to come in and do a story. We never could figure out who sprayed the pesticide, but we got it in the local Albuquerque news and even on the TV. And hopefully that helped a little bit. It helped people realize you use a pesticide in your neighborhood, you're taking the responsibility for all the pollinators for the whole neighborhood into account. And we have to think of better ways to raise food and flowers and lawn or whatever it is than pour poison all over everything.
Well, we've got other examples, even recently, of Jenny. She lost her bees in town from pesticide poisoning. And then there's another thing that we need to remember is that sometimes it creates a synergistic effect with what's already in your comb. We talked about that before, but what could be innocuous or inoffensive in the environment, generic pesticides that are supposed to be fine for the bees, can have a synergistic reaction with some of the treatments that beekeepers put in their colonies, especially if they're oil-based and they mix with the wax in the nest. And what was before acceptable level of toxicity for the colony and acceptable level of pesticides in the environment, they get together and it forms that super toxic reaction that actually kills your colony. And we know that Tiffany, for example, had that issue with comb that she thought was pristine and fresh from the bees and never treated, from a supplier that sold the bees to her as untreated. And it turns out they were coming from a third-party provider who was treating with Apivar, which is actually very common to have a synergistic reaction with some of the fungicides in the fields. So she lost her hives just the same way. They all died. And not only that, but the comb became contaminated. So to your point earlier, your honey was also lost. It was not just the bees, it was also the entire crop and the comb that you could not really reuse to restart colonies, right?
Right, because I came back to the dead bees, and I stared at them for a while. I realized I can't ethically harvest that honey. It's ready to be harvested, but it's going to be totally contaminated. I don't know what to do with the comb. I can't reuse the comb because it would poison the bees. What about the woodenware? It's, the bee is all smeared with bee feces, and the bees had been ingesting the pesticide. So I wound up burning everything, and that was thousands of dollars of loss instead of several $1,000s of gain. And those bees I had raised for disease resistance, I couldn't buy bees like that. You know what I mean? I could only raise them from my other bee. I had another bee yard that didn't get hit by the pesticide. So I could raise more bees in that bee yard and now take its production down to make more bees. It was a terrible loss. And it really made me angry. And that's why I like to advocate that as beekeepers, we can find ways to raise bees without resorting to toxicity. And then we have the moral right to begin to demand that the people around us stop using toxic solutions and that they remember us and our bees. But the bees are just the canary in the mine. All the other insects, the birds that eat the insects, the reptiles, the amphibians, and fish that eat the insects, we're poisoning ourselves. We're poisoning our world. And this has nothing to do with Democrats or Republicans. This goes beyond that. We have to find ways to live where we don't poison ourselves. And we have to leave a less toxic world behind for our grandchildren than the world that we inherited, rather than a more toxic world. And the only way, and so that's part of my young beekeepers' determination to go what we now call treatment free. Not use antibiotics, not use pesticides, miticides in the beehive. There are alternatives that work very well. And as a matter of fact, work a lot better. We can free ourselves from the toxicity and connect with the vitality that nature has in its DNA. I believe that nature wants us to succeed, but we have to succeed with a gut microbiome and a hive and a world full of insects, healthy insects, and healthy insect, bird, reptile populations. I live with a daughter-in-law here, and she was raised in a very urban environment and was not used to insects. And she found a little, what I call a desert cockroach, like we get in our beehives sometimes. Little outside cockroach. She found one by the door in the house, and she kind of freaked out, and she called me and she said, put down home defense. This is a terrible poison. I thought, her daughters, my granddaughters, are right there in the house. No, home defense is not home defense, it's home offense. And that's said, she managed to catch the cockroach. I said, take it outside and let it go. All those lizards that are crawling on the walls outside, one of them would love to eat that cockroach. It absolutely won't hurt anything. And we got by, but that just shows how there's this sort of trained response. Oh, an insect, quick, psst, squirt some raid on it. And that's crazy. We never had that until recently. And now that seems to be our quick response is to, there's an insect, quick, kill it with a poison. And now realize we just poisoned our house.
Right. And very often, by the way, the problems with cockroaches in the house, if you're poisoning them, you're not taking care, it's a symptom of an underlying issue again, which is humidity or water in your dark places. So if you just kill them with poison and you don't resolve this issue, it's going to keep happening anyway, which is kind of an interesting parallel with what we're doing with the bees, right? As far as
Exactly.
I'm concerned, the bees, the colonies, if they've got a great vitality, they're going to stay healthy. It's only when that vitality is compromised that they will start falling prey to things and viruses that are transmitted by mice. The mice are going to be in there anyway, at least in the United States. There's going to be pressure from several pests, including wax moths and small hive beetles. But as long as the colony is vibrant and is vitally strong, that's not going to take a hold. It's only when they start getting weaker that becomes an issue. And that's true with every pest and pathogens usually. And actually, I would argue that using some of that pressure from the pests and the mites and the small hive beetles and the wax moths, like you said, don't smush those small hive beetles. Just let the bees learn how to live with them or fend them off. That's going to make them stronger. So we want, I mean, there's a parallel there as well. But before I let you continue, Les, I just wanted to jump in and mention Sherry Lane says that in Texas right here, she's seeing, we went from yellow pollen and she's not seeing some red pollen. So that's something interesting. She's seeing a change in flowering in the area that she can look at visually in her hive. So I thought that was very interesting. And then Jay Arnold on YouTube is asking a couple of questions. Excuse me. Excuse me. First of all, he was saying when we get hot in the field, if we don't have anything and we really want in a pinch to get a little cooler, that jug of ice cold water or cold water that we have with us, pour it down our neck, on our head. And I've done it. I've poured it through my suit just as a quick fix. But also I was mentioning those ice vests. That's something that's a little bit more expensive. And it's only limited in time with the amount of about 30 minutes by set of sheets of ice cubes. Basically they are, you just kind of strap them onto yourself with an isolating vest. And then if you have extra, you can keep them in your chest cooler and just kind of bring them out as you go to refresh them and stay cool longer. And it works really well, but it's a much more expensive and cumbersome way. Less you're a minimalist, so you're probably shaking your head, and I just understand that, but it's something that can work if you're wanting to. He's asking on the subject of an ag exemption, do you have to renew this every year? And it's in Texas. So no, you don't have to reapply every year. Once you've been approved in year 6, that ag evaluation is for you to keep as long as you maintain the number of colonies or whatever livestock that you're supposed to have on the land to satisfy the minimum intensity requirements for your county. Now, if you switch over to wildlife on the property 5 to 20 acre, you can do that as long as you've had 1 year of ag valuation of 1D1 open space. So that at that point, if you switch over, you have to reapply again in the spring, and then you have to have a 5-year plan for wildlife, pick 3 activities and maintain those for the 5 years, or you might lose your wildlife exemption. But at least you don't have to keep as many bees, and that can help with the intensity in the carrying capacity in your area where you don't have as many colonies for the amount of food, and the ones that you do have are actually stronger and healthier because they don't have to compete so much for food. So hopefully that answers your question. He's under 25 acres and he bought a place that had it for cattle. So if you just bought the place this year, next year you're still going to have to do ag valuation, and with the bees up to 20 acres, if you're doing it with the cows to keep the 25 acres, then you would have to do it, in 2023 as well. And in 2024, if you wanted to, you could switch over to wildlife. So that's something to keep in mind. And he's in Bonham, Texas, Les. So with that, I wanted to circle back around and let you kind of continue talking about pesticides and all this stuff. And by the way, that's exactly why personally, when I first started beekeeping, I went to all those bee clubs and they were all talking about how you have to treat your bees or they will die. You have to put all those poisons in there. And I couldn't figure out why I would want to do that, because then I wouldn't want to eat that honey. That's the other aspect of things, right? When you treat and you put those pesticides into the hives, I mean, all of them say you either have to remove the supers or whatever. What does that tell me? That tells me it gets into the honey, right? So
Right, yeah.
I don't want to do that. But go ahead, Les. I didn't mean to interrupt for so long. I just wanted to kind of slide everybody in. And if you have other questions, by the way, still type them in the chat window and or on YouTube in the comments. And we'll get you around. If you don't ask questions, we're going to keep talking. So just a word of warning there. Les.
Well, so that was, like you pointed out, having a healthy hive keeps them healthy, and they can overcome. We now have bees that fairly easily overcome mites. Aren't bothered by small hive beetle. Hive moths, wax moths have been with bees ever since there's been bees and wax moths. Ever since I was a kid, we had wax moths, and they don't threaten the bees. They clean up the mess as the bees contract. So they're not a real problem. I one time recently had a hive die out and get eaten by the wax moths. And I opened it up and I realized, oh, it's completely over, just a big ball of wax moth webbing, and it's shredded. It's no good anymore. I didn't really have time to clean it, so I left it. Next week or 2 weeks later, I went back. Okay, I'm going to clean that hive up. Went over to it and saw the bees were flying in and out of it, and they were carrying pollen. What the heck? Mm-hmm. So I opened it up, and they had cleaned out the front section, the worst section, piled a bunch of stuff up in the back. There were still a lot of cocoons wedged into the wood here and there, all around. But the bees were building perfectly straight on the top of our hive, on the 6 or 8 combs, and clearing the wax moths as they did it. And I realized they fit with the wax moth like a hand in a glove, and they don't mind a bit what the wax moth did, and they're really not the least bit perturbed, and they're cleaning them out as they need to. And the bees can live with wax moths just fine, and wax moths are not my enemy. And yet, of course, wax moths are an enemy to many people, but partly because we want to store supers. And that's another reason I went over to tupper hives, because there was no storage of comb over the winter that I had to worry about wax moths and fumigate. I was in 2016 diagnosed with cancer, and I think it had a lot to do with working for a commercial beekeeper and being exposed to heavy doses of ethylene dibromide back when I was a kid, and we didn't realize how carcinogenic it was. And I would come out of there smelling of it for hours. My breath, I absorbed it in my breathing, and my breath smelled of it for hours later. And that could well have been part of what I did to myself and what we are doing to ourselves as a result of all this toxicity. And we're much better off without it. We're entering into the age where we can figure out how the microbiome works. It's extremely complicated. It takes literally artificial intelligence and computers to totally figure out how our gut microbiome works or how the soil microbiome works. But we have artificial intelligence and computers, and we're getting there. And this is the time when we can rise into more biologically sound lifestyle and farming style, where we raise multiple crops on a piece of land that help each other and that all make a little money for the farmer. And we learn to raise the beneficial insects. For instance, cockroaches. We can raise little tiny wasps called ensign wasps that seek and destroy cockroach eggs. They fly into dark, dank closets and water, places where you do have your plumbing. And they find the cockroach eggs, lay their eggs on the cockroach eggs, their larvae eats the cockroach eggs and then pupates as a little wasp, little ensign wasp. We could be raising ensign wasps instead of spraying poison all over our houses. And that's easy to do. I've seen it. I've raised ensign wasps when I lived in Pflugerville. All you have to do is set aside a space for cockroaches, and pretty soon, if you don't poison the cockroaches, the ensign wasps will appear. You know, I did that with tomato hornworms. I set aside a patch. My job as a little boy was to help my grandpa pick tomato hornworms off tomatoes. And then we came to some that had little white, like hairs, and little beads at the end of the hair on the caterpillar. My grandpa said, "Don't pick those hornworms." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because they're infected with a parasite." And sure enough, those little beads were eggs of a wasp. It went down in and killed the hornworm, ate it from the inside out, and then a bunch of wasps came out of the body of the hornworm and went out to hunt more hornworms. So we can use nature, and it goes right back to our favorite bunch of insects, ants, bees, and wasps. We know that we can use ants and wasps to protect our crops, and they are protecting our crops even as we speak. There are wasps that love to eat corn earworms. Well, we need more of those. And that means when we use a pesticide, we kill the predators of our pests more effectively and for a longer period of time than we kill the pests. So once we use a pesticide, we've now made the world better for the pests, and the pests can come back with a vengeance and more quickly work on becoming resistant to the pesticide than the predators, because predators often have a much slower life cycle.
So
we
Les,
really need to work.
you're talking about basically biological control, right? Which is an integral part of integrated pest management.
Right, exactly. We could learn to use more and more biological controls. Even we could help the farmers in the almonds. Turns out that the molds in the flowers mess up almond production, so they're using fungicides during the bloom, which hurt the bees. Turns out there's a beneficial mold or fungus that we could dust on the bees in the beehive, let them take it to the almond flowers, and it protects the almond flowers better than the fungicide, and it doesn't hurt the bees. So that's using nature instead of fighting nature, using good fungus instead of fighting bad fungus. Problem with fighting bad fungus is it's a losing battle, because we use a certain fungicide. Funguses are amazing at developing resistance to fungicides. They just very quickly resist a fungicide. This is something they found out in the tropical areas where they're growing bananas. There's some Cicatoca negra, a black fungus, soil fungus, that kills banana trees. And they finally realized they needed to use soil microbiome rather than more stronger and stronger fungicides, because all the fungicides, the fungus quickly became totally resistant to. So they needed to use good fungus in the soil to protect the trees from the bad fungus. So we have to stop fighting nature, start learning from nature how nature isn't all about competition. It's about cooperation. We need to cooperate better with nature and with each other. And then same is true with plastic. The world is full of pesticides. And it's full
So
of
let's bring up the next topic, which is the plastics. But I wanted to jump in real quick. I apologize, Les. I wanted to make sure that we addressed Richard's question. Is it easy to tell the difference between honey and funny honey, meaning the honey that was made with stored sugar syrup or anything else, actually, I would say, any funny honey that's made out of corn or rice syrup or things like that? How is it
It,
easy
it
to?
is it's not terribly easy. They work really hard at figuring out, like, I met some beekeepers that worked with somebody in a university in the East Coast, I think somewhere near Baltimore. They made a machine that could test sugar or syrups and identify whether it was made from beet sugar,
Mhm.
cane sugar, high fructose corn syrup, all these different types of syrups and the sugars that are available. And it's a fairly sophisticated machine. But we also have to realize that the people that are making these funny honeys, these adulterated honeys, also have pretty high level of sophistication. And there was a journalist who was studying this, wrote a paper about it it's been 5 or 6 years now. And he went into India and he was tracking down a lead. And he said, he met somebody who said, I can get you train car loads and it will pass all the tests. We even mix bee pollen in it that we buy from America. So when they look, they see the bee pollen and it will pass all the tests. And the guy said, oh, good. I've been curious about this because I'm a journalist. And suddenly the guy realized he wasn't talking to a buyer, but to an investigator. He yanked the card out of his fingers and took off and left the room because
Oh,
he didn't want to give himself away.
yeah.
So it's tricky. And that's the best thing is you get to know your beekeeper or be a beekeeper yourself, of course. Then you know what you got in your honey. Or get to know the beekeepers at the farmers markets and find somebody you think you can trust. Even that is dangerous because unfortunately beekeepers in farmers markets often quickly run out of honey that they produced. They wind up trying to buy honey and rebottle it and sell it as if they were their own. And they often wind up not realizing it, but they're buying a sugar-based product that has got a little molasses and whatever mixed into it to make it look and smell and taste a bit like honey.
Mm-hmm. So a couple of stories. I drive by the intersection of 1826 and 8 Branch Road 12 all the time. There's usually like somebody sitting at the corner and he's got a bunch of things like knives and things, but also pure raw honey, like big banners, and he probably sells a lot of it. So I stopped by the other day and I was like, hey, you're a beekeeper? He's like, no, I'm not, but my friend is a remover, a professional remover. So he basically cuts out colonies out of walls and then sells the comb with the honey or gives it to the gentleman, and he extracts it and sells it as honey that's actually illegal to do. You're not allowed to do that in Texas. The law strictly prohibits the sale of removal honey because you never know if it's been exposed to pesticides. If the property owner have tried the spray, wasp spray or whatever to try to get rid of the bees, it can be in insulation. It can be dead, rodents or feces of, mice and dead cockroaches and all kinds of stuff. So it's not allowed. And so that's another example of know your beekeeper, but also ask the right questions. And then the other one was that you got, and it kind of escaped me, but it's just kind of you want to know who your beekeeper is so that you know exactly what they're putting into their honey. But there's no way, even if you make your own honey and you feed your bees a lot of sugar syrup at the wrong time, and you just keep pumping that sugar syrup, and they're hoarders, so they might actually store it into your honey supers and you might not realize it, but what you're harvesting later is funny honey in effect, because it's just mix of sugar syrup that's got some nectar mixed in with it and is going to taste a little bit like honey. But usually you can kind of tell it does taste like sugar syrup, actually dehydrated sugar syrup. So just kind of, short of doing the tests on your honey, and there's a few that are available, but there's several levels, and all the people that are producing that funny honey internationally have learned to circumvent the tests. And there's the latest one that's actually pretty good and it's hard to cheat. Some kind of I forget what the name is, RN or DN, or do you remember last what the new test is?
I think they were using some DNA.
Yes,
In the DNA they find in
because
the
there was
honey.
there was C3 and then C4, which was better, and then there's now the one that you cannot cheat as well, is that new DNA kind of honey. But yeah, it's kind of interesting. Brad is asking a question, by the way. Why are so many people posting about having dry comb, no nectar, but a lot of capped brood? Is it because that's my follow-up question. Is it because they're basically consuming all the nectar that's coming in and living hand to mouth? I think they're kind of hungry when you do that, when they're doing that, right? That's kind of a tricky situation. They obviously have enough to rear brood and capped brood, but they don't have any extra and potentially are living hand to mouth and potentially suffering from malnutrition, meaning those larvae might not have had gotten as much good nutrition because of the shortage. What is your take on that, Les? That's an excellent question.
Well, here in Central Texas, we could have that situation. But I see a different situation where they made a bunch of honey in the late spring, early summer, and kind of backfilled and contracted. But they do have, and now they're starting to raise a bunch of brood. They quit raising brood when it got really, really hot. And they almost completely stopped, or completely did stop for a little while. And they contracted, they had such a small little space for the queen to lay that there was very little room. But now she started to lay, and they're rather quickly beginning to raise more and more brood. But they still have some honey left for the most part. Now, if you harvested all the honey back when they had it and they were contracting, you might be in trouble where they feel there's honey coming in and they want to expand, but they're really working on fumes. And that is a little bit of a danger. You might want to feed them a little bit. The problem with feeding them is then you suddenly become responsible for their population, and you have to juggle that until they make a smooth landing, hopefully with some flowers. I keep praying for a nice, gentle disturbance in the Gulf, a tropical storm, not a hurricane. I don't want anybody hurt, but we need the rain. We really could use the rain right now. And you mentioned the woman that she noticed a difference in the pollen. I've seen that bright red pollen coming in. I have no idea what it's from. The off yellow or white pollen was Texas sage, I'm pretty sure. That came out in a nice bloom right after the rain. And now it's kind of drying up. And I don't know what is making that red pollen, but I'm happy to see it. There's sumac waiting to bloom, but it could really use the rain.
So if you're in Central Texas, we were in the field for the apprenticeship on Saturday, and that was in the Creedmoor area, basically. But I see it here also in Driftwood, and we have a lot of fake willow. It's called also pussy willow or coyote weed or poverty weed and coyote willow. And so that one's about to pop. The flowers are right around the corner, and that's a great crop, by the way. I love that honey because that's the one that kind of crystallizes really into a nice smooth paste. So if you want to try what Les was talking about earlier, to remove honey supers and just put new ones, or just making sure that you have combs for the tabar hives where you can isolate that new crop. That's delicious honey. That's probably one of my favorite, along with the Persimmon one that has a creme brulee taste. So the other things that was about to bloom, and it's starting to come out of the ground, and it's going to bloom in just a couple, 3 weeks, I think. From the looks of it, is goldenrod. It's starting. I've seen flowers popping out here and there, and there were a lot of things that were starting to kind of come up. Ragweed was up, which is not good for our allergies, but it's good for honey, for the bees anyway, to get some food. So just kind of keep that in mind. But yeah, that's yeah.
Hopefully we're going to have a fall flow, and this is at the beginning of the fall flow if you harvest some of your capped honey that is from before, then that'll get the fall honey more to itself.
Mhm.
But you just want to make sure you leave enough, don't harvest more than 9 combs or 12 combs, depending on where you are. Make sure that you don't expect the fall flow and it doesn't happen. And now you need to feed your bees after you took the honey. I always like to take the honey when I see that they're on another honey flow. I love to take honey before the honey flows all stop because I hate to get involved in a big robbing scene.
Right, exactly.
Wait till the honey all stops. There's no honey production. It's so hard to get in there and get out without getting them in robbie.
Mhm. Yeah, it's really bad that they once the dirt sets in and throughout the most of the dirt, and it gets a little bit better after a while, they kind of seem to be giving up, although we've seen some incidents towards the tail end of it. And then in the fall in Texas, when we have the winter coming, and basically the nectar stops before the cold months, and that's also an issue. So I'm sure that the pattern is somewhat similar across the world with dearth. But yes, Brad, I did say persimmon. Native persimmon trees are all over the place where we are anyway, and they do produce quite a bit of a really nice honey. So I mean, I like it personally. But the rain, we do need more. But I'm happy to see that it has the little bit that we've gotten has rekindled a little bit of the forage out there. We've got a lot of green stuff and things about to pop. So I'm glad. But you know, once in a while, rain is good.
When she says persimmon, she means persimmon.
Oh, please. Persimmon,
And
is that how you say it?
persimmon,
Persimmon.
and it's the native Texas persimmon, which is little black persimmon. I find them quite delicious. They grow really well on Natalie's property for whatever reason, exceptionally well it seems like, and they're fairly sweet and delicious.
I just toss the bays all over the place, and then we have a lot of deer and animals that love eating them. So there's just cat everywhere with the persimmon seeds in them. So that makes it. And then same thing with the fake willow. It just tends to blow over like dandelion flowers, like the little white fuzzy things once it's done blooming. So that's really great. Oh yeah, my dogs, they like to pull out those persimmon bays as well out of the trees when they can reach it. It's sweet, it's nice, it's tasty. Yeah. So Les, you wanted to talk about plastics. Do you want to talk about it tonight, or do you want to keep that for another theme? Because we have 5 minutes and I want to make sure everybody's had a chance to ask their questions as well.
Yeah, we don't really have time to get into plastic too much. Needless to say that obviously keeping bees without plastic is my ideal, and it's easy to do, and it's better to do and fun to do. So we don't need plastic, but we'll talk more about that later.
Right. But so I wanted to bring up another point related to that brood that was just brood and no nectar, nothing. They're just all brood basically. And that's an extreme. The other extreme that we saw at the end of the nectar flow and into the dearth in some of our hives, like funny enough, around where my teaching my home apiary is, there were some hives that were actually honey bound so much that there was almost no space for them to lay eggs. And I was very worried about that, but I like to experiment. So I just kind of left them there and didn't pull out anything, didn't give them empty comb or anything. And I just came back in there today, last, and I'll be happy to report that they actually ended up going through and making space. And they only have like two, that was in the Langstroth, 2 frames on each sides and 6 in the middle with full of capped brood. So somehow they figured out how to use it and just make space for the bees to brood up. But they had contracted to a tiny little population. And I just want to remind people that, yes, when you have dearths, especially when they're long and extended, that population is really going to contract if you're not feeding them artificially, right? And it is kind of scary. But very often, if that colony that was an established colony, that usually settles itself back. They know the cycles, they know the amount of forage, and when they go into dearth, and they're able to plan ahead for it. So in effect, they did fantastic. They had planned for like winter, right? An extended period of dearth. They have all that honey and very little brood, which by the way was really great for their cleansing cycle, and curbing the mite pressure. It's a nice brood break, and yes, there was more mites on the bees, but they were not able to reproduce, so they overwinter better as well. So that's very interesting. I thought less they would do that, and now they're just exploding in population, getting ready to collect all that nectar from the fall flow and get into winter even stronger, I guess.
Yeah, and when the mites have to come out on the bees because there isn't any brood or very little brood, that's when they're susceptible to being groomed off, falling off.
That's right.
So that really cleansed the mites. That brood break cleansed the mites. And I think the bees use the honey to inhibit the queen from laying. And then they did quickly decide, okay, now let's soak up a bunch of honey, move it to the back of the hive, and give her a space to lay. And I've seen the same thing where they went down to almost nothing or actually nothing. And I was worried there was even a queen in the hive. And then now all of a sudden they go back and there's 4 or 5 combs just packed with brood and eggs. And they're gearing up they seem to be gearing up for a good honey flow. I hope they're right. They seem to know more than I do. And that's where I like to let bees be bees and me not try to dictate what they should be doing, because they know what they should be doing as good or better than I do. They know how to be bees better than I know how they should be bees.
Well, and to your point, Les, I mean, I tend to like to have drawn worker comb as my gold, and it's just kind of like when they're filled and they've got no more space, I kind of like to slide in a little open, worker comb for them to lay and just encourage growth of the population. But really, in reality, I'm also interfering with their natural cycles, because that's going to encourage the queen to lay where maybe the colony didn't want her to lay, right? So that's something to keep in mind. And I think that it behooves us to all be very mindful of whatever interventions we're imposing on the bees and how it interferes with their natural cycles, right, Les?
Right. We have to wonder where the conscious entity is in a beehive. Because the queen isn't deciding to not lay eggs and reduce the population. The cleaner bees are cleaning cells for her, or they're not. They don't. She doesn't have anywhere to lay eggs. It's not up to. She's not making the decision. It's a group of workers that somehow make these joint decisions, and it really does bend the mind around where is the conscious entity in a beehive, whether it's which individual bees and how do they self-designate or designates them? And I don't know the answer. I just find it fascinating to work with them and learn from them and watch them and realize that they're pretty smart, given the size of their brains, which is about the size of a grain of sand. They're amazingly smart with what they do with that tiny little brain.
Right, exactly. Hey, I wanted to say hi to Grant. He said they had 300 millimeters of rain last month at home in St. Andrews, Australia. So they've had quite a bit of rain, and hopefully that will bring you some good forage, some good nectar flow for the spring. I know you guys are getting into your spring and potentially pretty soon to your swarming season. So I hope that's a good thing for you guys. It's a lot of rain, and in our neck of the wood, we like the rain as long as it's not every day for 3 weeks, because it allows the flower to bloom. So with that, I wanted to say, if you guys like this content, go to your YouTube channel and Be Mindful, and just kind of subscribe and like the recordings, and just kind of get that notification so you know when the next ones are coming in. You can browse the past recordings and send us your questions. I wanted to thank everybody on YouTube from Texas, from Australia, and everywhere, and as well as on Zoom for joining us tonight. Really appreciate your questions, and love having you. Just come on back next week, ask your questions, and we'll talk about plastics, both in the hives and in the environment. But most of all, I wanted to thank our expert or guru or just I'm a groupie, I'm a fan, and I'm just so delighted to be able to work with Les Crowder. And thank you for making the time to be here and answer your questions, Les. We really appreciate you.
Well, thank you, Natalie. I really appreciate you setting this all up, and thank you, everybody, and we'll see you as soon as possible.
See you next week. Thank you, guys. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.